armies, it was about personalities and global politics, and even the weather playing a part.
Yeah, like that curveball with George Washington. I mean, we all picture him leading troops, on land, but Philbrick shows us a different side of him.
Yeah.
Did you know Washington was actually a pretty skilled sailor?
He was. There's a story about him handling a small boat during a squall, and he even impressed some French dignitaries with his skills. It seems all that time surveying and, navigating Virginia's waterways really paid off.
Makes you wonder what would have happened if he had gone for a naval career. It seemed like a real possibility for him, especially with his half-brother Lawrence.
Exactly. Lawrence served in the British Navy and named his estate Mount Vernon after a British admiral he admired. It's kind of ironic, isn't it? Washington ends up relying so much on the French Navy. But he almost died from smallpox on a voyage to Barbados earlier in his life.
Right. Almost a completely different path for him and for history. But speaking of the French Navy, that reliance wasn't always smooth sailing, was it?
Oh, definitely not. If you read Washington's letters from this time, you really get a sense of how desperate things were. He even writes, "I see nothing before us but accumulating distresses. We have lived upon expedients till we can live no longer." The American Navy just couldn't compete with the British. Washington had no choice but to rely on alliances.
Which brings us to another big player in this story, the Caribbean. I never realized how important it was to the Revolution.
It was a powder keg. All these European powers were fighting over the trade routes. And then you have the hurricane of 1780. Like Philbrick says, it really shook things up. It weakened both the British and French fleets.
The way Philbrick describes the HMS Phoenix caught in that hurricane is just terrifying. Sails shredded to coach whips, the ship almost capsizing. It's amazing anyone survived.
It is. But amidst all that destruction, it actually helped the Americans in a way. The British fleet took heavier losses, which made it harder for them to respond to things later on. It's a good example of how events outside anyone's control can really shape history.
Yeah, it wasn't just hurricanes they had to worry about. The French had their own logistical problems in the Caribbean. Philbrick talks about Admiral de Grasse trying to assemble his fleet, and even facing a fire aboard his flagship.
It's incredible he was able to pull it off. And we can't forget Francisco Saavedra, the Spanish diplomat. He basically went door to door in Havana, getting people to donate money for de Grasse's expedition.
Wow, talk about creative fundraising. So we have Washington, frustrated and needing help. We have the French fleet barely holding it together, and they're all headed towards the Chesapeake Bay.
The Chesapeake was key. It was the gateway to Virginia and the Carolinas, a real strategic choke point. Whoever controlled it could control the flow of supplies and troops.
It's like a high-stakes poker game when you read Philbrick's account. With the fate of Cornwallis's army at Yorktown hanging in the balance. This back and forth between the British and French fleets. A real cat-and-mouse game.
And Washington stuck in the middle, relying on letters for information, which were infrequent and sometimes intercepted. Talk about operating in the dark.
Not to mention the clashing personalities. That probably didn't help things.
Yeah, you've got Rochambeau on the French side, very methodical. And then you have de Grasse, much more impulsive. Philbrick hints at some friction between them. It makes you wonder how they managed to cooperate at all.
Right, and then there's the Marquis de Chastellux, Rochambeau's aide, secretly giving information to Washington. Espionage right in the middle of it all.
It shows how much personal connections mattered, even in the midst of all the strategy and military maneuvers. But all of this, the personalities, the maneuvering, Washington's hopes, it all led to the Battle of the Chesapeake.
And that battle sounds like it was a confusing mess. Missed opportunities on both sides. Chaotic maneuvering.
But here's where the French had something new. Their numerary signaling system. They could use flags to communicate complex orders during battle. It was much more sophisticated than what the British were using.
So the French were fighting a more modern battle in a way.
Exactly. And they were also influenced by Enlightenment thinking, approaching naval combat with a more analytical mindset. That combination gave them an edge. They did suffer heavier casualties, but they inflicted more damage on the British fleet and forced them to withdraw.
And that withdrawal was the turning point. It trapped Cornwallis at Yorktown and set the stage for the final showdown.
It was a decisive moment. The French had overcome a lot of challenges, and they played their part perfectly. Now all eyes were on Yorktown. Yorktown was more than just a battle. It was a siege, this massive operation with almost 19,000 French and American soldiers. Imagine trying to coordinate all those troops.
And 20,000 French sailors.
Right, crammed onto ships in Chesapeake. Just an incredible logistical feat.
What about the people in Yorktown, though? caught in the middle of all this.
It must have been terrifying, just constant bombardment, having to leave their homes and find shelter in the cliffs along the York River. Philbrick even describes hundreds of horse carcasses, slaughtered by the British washing ashore, just a grim reminder of the reality of war.
And in the middle of it all, we see Alexander Hamilton emerge. Philbrick highlights his leadership during the storming of Redoubts 9 and 10.
Yeah, a really crucial moment in the siege. It shows his ambition and his daring. He wanted to prove himself, and this was his chance. Leading the charge, rallying his men, even with fierce resistance.
Philbrick also brings in the voice of an ordinary soldier, Sergeant Joseph Plum Martin. His account of the assault really brings that chaotic scene to life.
It's so valuable to hear those personal stories. They remind us that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about the experiences of real people.
And speaking of people, we can't forget about Benedict Arnold. It's almost poetic justice that the events he set in motion by turning traitor led to this decisive American victory.
Yeah, his betrayal and those brutal attacks, like the massacre at Fort Griswold, they really fueled a desire for revenge among the Americans. Yorktown became a symbol of redemption, a chance to reclaim their honor and punish those who had betrayed them.
So Yorktown was the turning point, the beginning of the end for British hopes in the war. But the fighting didn't just stop immediately, right?
No, not at all. Washington still had major challenges to face. There was a lot of discontent within the Continental Army. They had sacrificed so much, endured years of hardship, and now they felt betrayed by a government that couldn't even pay them.
Philbrick really gets into the details of their grievances. The lack of pay, inadequate supplies, broken promises. It's no wonder some were considering a military coup.
Yeah, imagine the pressure Washington must have felt, trying to balance the needs of his soldiers. With his commitment to civilian control of the military, he understood their frustrations. But he also knew that letting the army dictate terms to the government would undermine everything they were fighting for.
It's amazing how he managed to hold it all together, appealing to their patriotism, advocating for them to Congress, and ultimately preventing a mutiny.
It really speaks to his leadership, his understanding of human nature, and his unwavering belief in the ideals of the Republic.
And all of this while dealing with personal loss and hardship. Philbrick mentions the death of his stepson, his declining health, and the constant pressure of leading a new nation.
Right, he never wavered in his commitment to duty.
Philbrick really shows us the human side of Washington. His anxieties, his frustrations, his moments of doubt. It makes his achievements even more impressive.
It reminds us that leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about making tough choices and staying strong in the face of adversity.
Speaking of adversity, Philbrick compares Washington with the French Admiral de Grasse. Both achieved incredible victories, but their fates were very different.
It's a fascinating contrast. De Grasse, after the Chesapeake, he went back to the Caribbean looking for more glory. But in the Battle of the Somme, he made some tactical errors, and the British were able to exploit weaknesses in the French fleet. He was captured, and his flagship, the Ville de Paris, was lost.
What a fall from grace. Makes you think about the dangers of overreaching.
Maybe. Washington, on the other hand, he stayed focused on the bigger picture. He knew that winning the war wasn't enough. It was about building a lasting peace and securing the future of the nation.
And that peace wasn't a sure thing. The negotiations were complex, both sides trying to get the best deal. Even after their defeat, the British weren't eager to just hand over independence.
It took months of diplomacy, strategic maneuvering, compromises from both sides to finally get a treaty. And even then, the future of the new nation was uncertain. The Articles of Confederation weren't really working, and there were deep divisions among the states.
It's a reminder that the revolution wasn't a single event. It was a process. A long and difficult journey towards self-government and national identity.
A journey with triumphs and compromises, moments of unity and periods of intense division. Washington finally got his wish to return to private life. Philbrick describes that emotional scene. Washington saying goodbye to his officers in New York, and finally returning to Mount Vernon.
After years of sacrifice and pressure, he could finally enjoy some peace and quiet. But even in retirement, his story wasn't over. He'd be called upon to lead the nation again, this time as its first president.
But that's another story. We're still in 1781, a year that really tested the American revolutionaries.
And it wasn't just about military victories or politics. Philbrick also shows us how this year forced a reckoning with the moral contradictions at the heart of the American experiment.
He highlights that tension in the conversation between Washington and Lafayette about slavery. Lafayette suggests they buy a plantation together and experiment with freeing the enslaved people, using them as tenants instead.
That's a pretty radical idea, especially for that time. And considering Washington was a slave owner himself, what was Washington's reaction?
He was hesitant. He knew slavery was a moral problem, but he just couldn't break free from that system. It was so ingrained in American society and in his own life.
It's interesting. It shows the limits even for someone like Washington, someone so revolutionary.
Right, like Philbrick says, the ideals of liberty and equality, they weren't always applied fairly, especially when it came to slavery.
And those unresolved issues, they would cause problems for the nation for years to come. But let's go back to the new nation and the challenges it faced. We talked about the discontent in the army. But what about the transition to peacetime? What happened to all those soldiers?
It was a tough adjustment. A lot of them were farmers, artisans, laborers. They had left everything behind to fight, and they came back to a society that had been completely changed by war.
Philbrick talks about Henry Knox, Washington's artillery chief. After the war, he started the Society of the Cincinnati, this group for American and foreign officers who fought in the Revolution.
It was meant to honor their sacrifices and keep those bonds strong, but it didn't go over well with everyone.
Or not.
Well, the idea of a hereditary society, even one for war heroes, it seemed like aristocracy, and that didn't fit with the ideals of the Republic.
It's interesting. Even after winning, they were still figuring out these basic questions about power and equality.
Right. The revolution wasn't just about fighting the British, it was about creating a new system, defining what it meant to be American.
And what about the people who stayed loyal to Britain? What happened to the loyalists after the war?
That's a complicated part of the story. Philbrick reminds us that the war divided communities, families, even friends. A lot of loyalists faced persecution. Their property was taken away. So many of them fled to Canada or other parts of the British Empire.
Revolutions are messy. They leave scars and conflicts behind. And the British, how did they deal with losing the colonies?
It was a blow to their pride, of course. But Philbrick says some were actually relieved. The war was expensive and divisive, and a lot of Britons were ready to move on.
So they saw it as more of a practical decision.
They knew the colonies were becoming harder to control, and that continuing the fight would just waste resources and make things worse.
I like how Philbrick gives us a more balanced view of the British side.
Right, he doesn't just make them the villains. He shows their own struggles and mistakes, and how they eventually accepted American independence.
He talks about people like Sir Guy Carleton,
Mm-hmm.
who took over for Clinton as commander-in-chief. He was known for his honor.
Yeah, he oversaw the evacuation of British troops from New York, and he did it really well. He earned the respect of both sides.
It's a good reminder that even in war, there can be moments of grace and compassion.
Both sides knew they needed peace.
And that peace led to a new era.
The American experiment, which had seemed radical at first, had actually worked.
It became an example for other countries.
And a challenge to the old systems of monarchy and empire.
So 1781, a year of incredible achievements, but also contradictions and unresolved issues.
It reminds us that the journey towards a more perfect union is never really over.
Philbrick's book captures all of that. The drama, the intrigue, the importance of this year.
It helps us understand the past and appreciate the challenges we face today.
We hope this deep dive has inspired you to learn more about this fascinating period.
There's always more to discover, more to question, more to connect with in the story of the American Revolution.